Imagine this scene. It's the summer of 1945, California. The war in the Pacific is technically over, but for a group of 50 Japanese women enemy nationals captured in Manila, their private war is just beginning.
Right.
They're pressed into the back of these military trucks. The canvas cover is hot and stifling. And for 6 weeks, they've been waiting in a pretty sparse internment camp, waiting for the inevitable moment of American cruelty that their entire society had promised them was coming.
The truck ride is just agonizingly silent, punctuated only by the jolting of the road. Their minds are reeling, just preparing for execution. The engine's finally cut, and the silence is shattered by a new, powerful sound. Russian water. They're beside a river.
And instantly, a woman screams, her voice just cracking with absolute terror. "They're going to drown us. They'll weigh down our bodies and throw us in."
Mass panic just erupts, sobbing, hyperventilating. They are absolutely certain this is the brutal end that all the propaganda had promised them.
But here is the incredible, almost unbelievable pivot point of this entire story.
The Americans were not building a death site beside the river. The rushing water was flowing into a newly constructed long wooden building with steam rising from the roof. And the distinct clean smell of lavender-scented soap was drifting on the warm California breeze. They had built a bathhouse.
Wow.
A bathhouse.
That profound moment of fear, of misunderstanding, and unexpected human decency is exactly what we explore here on Hidden Front History. The hidden complexities, the human truths found in these forgotten corners of World War II. Our mission today is to unpack the sources that you shared with us, focusing on how this simple, unexpected act of basic human dignity, a bar of soap shattered a lifetime of deeply held ideological propaganda, and fundamentally changed these women's lives forever.
Yeah, we're tracing the psychological and the physical journey of these 50 women. Many of them were nurses, school teachers, merchants' wives captured back in Manila. We're going to follow them through their initial terror and then the debilitating slow creep of cognitive dissonance during their captivity. And finally, their eventual devastating realization that everything they were taught about their enemy was entirely backwards.
And the key, really devastating question at the heart of this whole narrative, and it's the one you have to hold on to throughout this deep dive, is this. If the enemy treats you with more basic human dignity and respect than your own government ever did,
Yeah.
what does that mean about the totality of your belief system? It's not a simple choice between good and evil. It's a terrifying choice between a comforting lie and a very, very painful truth. Okay, let's unpack this.
To truly grasp the shockwaves that were created by that bar of soap, we really must first establish the psychological and ideological foundation these women were operating from. This is spring 1945. For them, the official government narrative was absolute truth. It was meticulously interwoven with the grand ideology of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
And that sphere wasn't just some economic or military policy, was it? It was a deeply spiritual, almost messianic vision.
Absolutely.
It promised Asia for Asians, liberating the continent from what they saw as the degradation and decadence of Western imperialism. And central to this was Japan's divine mission, their spiritual superiority over the materialistic, weak West. So victory wasn't just possible, it was inevitable, it was absolute.
And crucially, this ideology dictated a rigid, absolute code of conduct. Surrender was not merely dishonorable. It was completely unthinkable. It wasn't an option. And to maintain that rigidity, the propaganda had to portray the enemy, the Americans, not just as opponents, but as subhuman, savage monsters who had shown no mercy.
So the women were told that capture meant certain gruesome torture, humiliation, and immediate execution.
Exactly. This narrative was designed specifically to ensure absolute loyalty and, if necessary, suicidal resistance. There was no alternative.
And so when the inevitable finally arrived, when the American counteroffensive turned Manila into this inferno of artillery, rubble, and constant fire in March of 45, their expectation, as they emerged from the ruins, was the violent fulfillment of that prophecy. They were ready to be killed.
But the first reality check was a soft administrative slap, not a violent blow. The American soldiers who found them were not the raging, bloodthirsty beasts they had been promised. The sources described them as, exhausted, weary young men, covered in dust, some barely old enough to shave.
They were just GIs.
Yeah,
They were just GIs operating under procedure, not passion.
So instead of immediate torture, they were subjected to standard military processing. They were searched, certainly. Any military items or sharp objects were confiscated, but then they were given a medical exam and taken to a temporary processing center.
And that process itself was the first jarring moment of dissonance for them. Instead of a firing squad, they received a meal, rice and canned meat. Not luxurious by any stretch, but the sources emphasize it was Real food, not the thin gruel we have been eating for months. And then they were given a numbered tag tied to their wrists. And that simple numbered tag, the marker of bureaucracy, was a complete ideological contradiction.
Right. Why would you number the soon-to-be dead? Why would you feed the women you're about to execute?
It makes no sense within their framework.
None. And we are incredibly lucky to have the intimate record of this breakdown provided by a woman named Ko, a former schoolteacher from Osaka, who managed to maintain a secret diary throughout her captivity.
Her first quote from those early days is just. It's so profound because it shows her desperately trying to reconcile this act of kindness with the motive she expected. She wrote, in these tiny, cramped characters on hidden scraps of paper, "We are alive. I do not understand why. The soldiers gave us food, real food. Is this mercy, or are they fattening us for some worse fate? We cannot trust their actions."
Wow. Fattening us for some worse fate.
Yeah. That quote perfectly encapsulates the terror of ambiguity. If the Americans had followed the script, if they had abused or starved them, Ko's propaganda-driven worldview would have been confirmed, and she would have found a certain terrible peace in confirming her nation's narrative.
But unexplained kindness, or in this case, just adherence to military procedure, was fundamentally more terrifying than cruelty. Cruelty would have been predictable.
Right.
Decency made their world unpredictable. It suggests immediately that everything they were told is subject to doubt.
That's a critical distinction. And the record suggests this bureaucratic decency was almost weaponized by the U.S. forces, whether they intended it or not,
Yeah.
because it was so utterly inconsistent with their expected reality. They were prepared for predictable hatred. They were utterly unprepared for unpredictable administrative procedure that afforded them basic human rights. That doubt, in a total war context, is a psychological vulnerability that begins to unravel the entire fabric of their beliefs.
So as we move past that initial psychological shock in Manila, let's trace the physical journey they took, because the voyage itself provided the next series of devastating reality checks. They were loaded onto a military transport ship for the long, 3-week voyage across the Pacific to California.
And they were held in converted cargo holds. The conditions were certainly difficult, cramped, metal-framed bunks stacked high, the constant smell of seasickness and fear. But the sources are really consistent in stressing that the captivity was not inhumanely managed. The structure was consistent, a reflection of the U.S. system of handling POWs.
And that consistency was the problem for their ideology. They received regular, if monotonous, meals. Hardtack biscuits, canned vegetables, sometimes meat. After months of siege conditions in Manila where starvation was a daily reality, this consistency presented a profound internal conflict that really split the group.
So on one side, you had women driven by suspicion. They refused to eat.
Refused. They were convinced the food was poisoned or laced with drugs intended to soften them up or sterilize them. One woman, Micho, a hardline nurse, was a prominent voice in this group, insisting refusal was the only path to moral survival.
But on the other side, the body's primal need just overrode ideology. Women, many of whom had been severely malnourished, ate ravenously. They recognized this was survival.
Right. Your body just takes over.
Ko, again, she captured this internal agony in her diary. The contradiction is maddening. If they plan to kill us, why feed us 3 times a day? If they plan to keep us alive, for what purpose? We are enemy nationals, we have no value to them, and yet they feed us.
Her mind is just straining to reconcile the enemy's actions with the enemy's motivation. It just doesn't compute.
And adding to this internal grief was the agony of separation. They were these tight-knit groups, the teachers, the nurses, sharing rumors and fears, especially for the children who had been separated from them and sent to different facilities. That constant gnawing agony of not knowing their children's fates kept their grief intense, but the enemy was giving them nothing to justify their hatred.
So this internal pressure cooker fear, suspicion, hunger, and a complete lack of confirming cruelty continues for 3 weeks until they finally reach San Francisco Bay in late June. And the psychological landscape just explodes again.
The staggering sight of the city from the bay was the second and maybe more profound confirmation of the ideological deception. You have to remember, they had been indoctrinated to believe America was suffering, starving, dying under the Japanese onslaught, its cities reduced to ruins by Japanese spiritual strength.
And then what they saw was a thriving, completely intact metropolis. No rubble, no craters, no burned-out shells of buildings. Streetlights were glowing, traffic moved freely, and civilian life appeared utterly unaffected by war.
They arrived convinced they were winning the war, only to see evidence of a nation that had barely noticed it was under attack. One woman whispered the devastating question, "How can this be? We were told America was suffering, starving, dying. This looks like paradise."
And that sight, it just fundamentally undermines the core promise of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, the idea that Western materialism was spiritually weak and destined to fall to Japan's higher purpose. They were forced to witness the scope of their nation's deception in devastating detail,
Their country was ash.
and their enemy was abundance.
The subsequent train journey through California only reinforced this devastating truth with every passing mile. They traveled through the Salinas Valley, about 100 miles south, and through the train windows they saw this vast, impossible landscape. Farms bursting with crops, not subsistence farming, but huge, mechanized agriculture.
Right?
Towns with shops full of goods, not empty shelves. Laughing women in bright dresses, not women in uniforms scrounging for food.
The physical evidence was just overwhelming. It wasn't just that they lost the war, they realized they had been fighting based on a complete lie about the enemy's material strength and resilience. The propaganda had been completely, utterly backwards. This realization that they had sacrificed everything for a leadership that had completely deceived them is the necessary psychological precondition for the bathhouse moment to hold its true, devastating power.
So they arrive at the internment camp, which was located in these converted farm buildings. Sparse, institutional, certainly surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, reflecting their status as prisoners. But the barracks were clean, and they had narrow cots and blankets.
The administrative tone was set immediately by the camp commander, a Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. He addressed them through an interpreter, laying out the rules. And critically, he mentioned the Geneva Convention, a term few of the women had ever even heard of.
We really need to pause on the Geneva Convention here, because its presence is critical to this deep dive. Japan, in WWII, had technically signed the convention,
but had historically refused to ratify or adhere to its articles regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. They considered capture to be inherently dishonorable.
So for their government, there was no international law governing this. It didn't apply.
Exactly. But here, the American commander is explicitly invoking it, making a political statement. Harrison's pledge was clear, but it was utterly unbelievable to his audience. He said, "You are prisoners of war, but you will be treated with dignity according to international law. You will not be mistreated. You will not be starved. You will not be executed."
I wonder, given the immense resources the U.S. poured into the Pacific War, do we have any evidence that the treatment of these 50 women was, strategically planned? Or was this simply routine administrative decency that just happened to be amplified by the contrast with the Japanese propaganda?
Well, the sources suggest it was standard U.S. military protocol for POW camps in America, which happened to follow the Geneva Convention closely. But the effect of that protocol, given the women's deeply ingrained ideology, was absolutely strategic in its power. They were waiting for the cruelty, and the routine adherence to decency was far more corrosive to their beliefs.
Which brings us back to that fateful August afternoon, 6 weeks after their arrival. The trucks appear. No explanation, just curt commands to board.
And the assumption is immediate. The illusion is over. The long-dreaded moment of cruelty has finally arrived.
The ride was stifling and terrifying. Every woman gripped her neighbor, coat, true to her nature, focused on the sensory details of her final moments, trying to memorize the sight of the California orchards as they flew past the edge of the canvas.
And when the engine cuts and that powerful sound of rushing water confirms their deepest fears, the mass drowning, the execution ritual, the panic just takes over completely.
Yuki, the young telephone operator, screams first, confirming the collective horror. "They're going to drown us. This is how they'll do it." Sachiko, the nurse, goes into full hysteria. She's hyperventilating.
And the American soldiers, like this young corporal from Nebraska, they just stand there baffled, pointing and trying to use simple English phrases. Bath, water good, calm down. But the words are useless against the sheer primal terror.
So an interpreter is frantically summoned. A Japanese-American soldier from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, an American fighting unit composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans.
Another layer of complexity right there.
Right, he climbs into the truck and immediately speaks rapid, authoritative Japanese. "Listen to me, please. You are not in danger. They have built a bathhouse. A proper bathhouse with hot water and soap. This is for bathing. Nothing else. You are safe."
The psychological shift must have been immediate and just overwhelming. The release from the certainty of death, only to be replaced by the bewildering reality of soap and hot water.
And this is the moment where Ko, representing the collective ideological confusion, asks the most penetrating question of the war. Her voice shaking, she asks the interpreter, "Why would they build us a bathhouse? We are prisoners. We are the enemy. Why would they waste American resources on our comfort?"
And the interpreter's response is the final, devastating nail in the coffin of their propaganda. Because the Geneva Convention requires it, and because this is how America treats prisoners of war, with basic human dignity.
Wow.
The answer reveals a fundamental structural commitment to human rights that their own state had utterly lacked.
I have to pause there. That moment, the simple act of providing a basic necessity being the final, shattering moment of ideological defeat. It's almost literary. It sounds like something out of a novel.
It does. They slowly disembarked, still wary, approaching the structure.
Right.
And as they got closer, the smell confirmed the unbelievable. The overwhelming scent of soap-clean, fresh, impossibly luxurious was intoxicating and disorienting.
The sources reveal an incredible detail here, too. The Army Corps of Engineers had actually researched traditional Japanese bathing customs. The design wasn't just a standard military shower block.
No, it included a changing area, washing stations with low stools and buckets for scrubbing, and, critically, a large communal pool for soaking, mimicking the onsen or sento experience.
So think about the implication of that. The enemy cared enough to dedicate resources and time to research their cultural customs to ensure the facility was appropriate for their comfort. This deliberate adherence to dignity and respect was a harder, more insidious blow to their belief system than any torture could have been.
A female Army nurse, a Lieutenant Roberts, explained the process. They would each receive a bar of soap, a towel, and a clean camp dress. For 6 weeks, they had endured washing in cold water latrines with this harsh, coarse lye soap. Now, hot water, real soap, and clean towels.
And Ko, the former schoolteacher and sort of the intellectual center of the group, was among the first to disrobe. She stood at a washing station, and when she picked up the bar of soap, smooth, white, smelling faintly of lavender, the emotional dam just broke. She couldn't stop the tears streaming down her face. She later wrote that it was such a small thing, but it represented something she could not name, something that terrified her more than drowning would have.
Because drowning would have been the noble, if terrible, end. It would have confirmed their sacrifice and their hatred.
Exactly. The soap was evidence that their sacrifice, their hatred, and their honor might all have been based on a catastrophic, deadly lie perpetuated by their own leadership.
The experience was cathartic in the deepest sense. Women washed themselves 3, 4, even 5 times, scrubbing away the layers of dust and fear, unable to believe the hot water wouldn't run out. Yuki, the one who had screamed about the drowning, sank into the communal pool and just floated on her back, staring in stunned disbelief at the ceiling.
Even Micho, the most ideologically rigid nurse, was momentarily shattered. She tried to cling to the old narrative, muttering that it was a trick, a way to soften us up before something truly horrific happens. But the source notes, the steam and the scent of lavender made her denial sound weak, even to herself.
They returned to the camp in a stunned, fragile silence, smelling of laundry soap. And Ko clutched the bar of soap she was allowed to keep, treating it like a sacred yet, polluting artifact.
Ko's diary entry that night just seals the emotional impact of the moment. She wrote, "Today I thought I would die. I was certain of it. Instead, I was given a bath, hot water soap that smells like flowers. These are such small things. Children take them for granted, but they have broken something inside me. If the enemy, the supposed beasts, gives us soap and dignity, then what does that mean about everything we were told to believe about the superiority of our own nation? The bar of soap became a physical, undeniable piece of evidence contradicting absolute ideology."
The bathhouse was a powerful, singular moment for sure. But the deeper, more profound erosion of hatred happened over the next several months through the sheer, repetitive, monotonous routine of human dignity. The weekly bathhouse visits evolved from a source of terror to a source of comforting, even guilty, pleasure.
Camp life was designed to be adequate. Roll call was twice daily, and the women were required to answer to their numbers with the phrase, "Hi, yes." A moment of forced deference, yes, but also a paradoxically reassuring one. They were being counted, they were documented, they weren't being disappeared.
The food was plain but consistent. Oatmeal, eggs, sometimes canned hash, and always the famously terrible U.S. Army coffee.
Of course.
But it was nutritionally adequate. They were given work assignments, laundry, kitchen, sewing labor designed to keep them healthy and occupied. Crucially, the sources emphasized this was not backbreaking forced labor. It was a maintenance routine, and they were paid small stipends and tokens.
And those tokens led directly to the ultimate source of sustained cognitive dissonance, the camp canteen. This wasn't a military supply depot. It was stocked with small luxuries that seemed impossible in a world defined by scarcity. Chocolate bars, writing paper, combs, hand cream, and even lipstick.
For women who had been reduced to fighting for survival in the Manila ruins, these items were revolutionary. Their very availability suggested that their captors saw them as human beings with needs and desires beyond mere caloric intake. If the Americans truly saw them as subhuman monsters, why would they waste logistics on providing lipstick or writing paper?
It's the small details that matter most. There was a Sergeant Wallace, an older guard described as having a permanent frown, who made sure that hand cream was stocked consistently in the canteen during the cold, dry California winter. It was a purely pragmatic gesture, preventing cracked hands. But to the women, who were trained to view the enemy as pure aggression, it was an act of logistical thoughtfulness that directly challenged the monster narrative.
In Yuki, the young telephone operator, she shifted her focus from the trauma of the bathhouse panic to an obsession with chocolate. She meticulously hoarded her tokens to buy a Hershey's bar, a profound luxury, which she shared like a sacred object with her bunkmates, each taking a tiny, single square. The sweetness became the subversive force, allowing them to reclaim fragments of their individual humanity and personal pleasure, rather than existing solely as representatives of the imperial state.
Alongside the small luxuries, there was the agonizing lifeline of the Red Cross mail. Weekly letters were permitted, though heavily censored, and they often took months to reach their destination. Ko wrote religiously to her mother in Osaka, using careful, neutral terms, asking about her brother Tishi, deliberately hiding her internal confusion and the fact that she was consistently being fed.
Then, in late September, Ko received her mother's reply. It was fragile, worn, and devastating. Her mother confirmed she and Tishi were alive, but detailed the pervasive, desperate starvation sweeping Osaka.
And this created the most acute psychological burden of their captivity, the guilt of survival. By this point, the women's faces had filled out. Their bodies had regained curves. Captain Martinez, the camp doctor, noted the improvements, recording their weight gain with professional satisfaction. But for the women, every pound gained felt like a profound betrayal of their starving, ruined homeland.
This internal struggle became visible in the barracks. Micho, the bitter nurse who still clung fiercely to the old ideology, stood before the communal latrine mirror one morning and just self-loathed, asking her reflection, "Look at you, fat and fed while your country burns. What kind of Japanese woman are you?" The enemy's kindness had become a source of corrosive guilt and internal shame, complicating their emotional landscape far more effectively than any act of cruelty ever could.
The psychological fortress of hatred began to break down further, not through policy, but through individual interactions with the guards. While most maintained professional distance, a few broke the pattern with consistent small acts of humanization.
There was a Private Cooper, a lanky young man from Tennessee, who made it a daily practice to smile and deliver his awkwardly pronounced attempt at "Ogo, good morning" in Japanese during the morning roll call. Just a small, consistent gesture of recognition.
And then there was Corporal Johnson, the one who had witnessed the bathhouse panic. He decided to actively chip away at the monster propaganda. He brought magazines life, looked with detailed photographs of intact American life, reinforcing the scale of the abundance they had seen from the train. He installed a radio, bringing them music and news, connecting them to a civilian world they weren't supposed to believe existed.
Most importantly, when he learned several women were former schoolteachers, he brought children's books and humbly asked them to teach him simple Japanese phrases. He treated them not as prisoners, but as functional experts in a valuable subject. His earnest attempts at pronunciation were terrible, but his sincerity was profoundly disarming.
These months of slow, consistent gestures culminated in the strange, surreal event of the camp talent show in November. Prisoners performed traditional folk dances for a small audience of polite, applauding captors, ignoring the barbed wire just beyond the lights. Yuki performed, and Corporal Johnson sincerely thanked her, bowing awkwardly to match her formal low bow. This normalizing activity was just unsettling in its profound ordinariness.
Kamei analyzed this cumulative contradiction in a later diary entry. She wrote, "We are prisoners, but we are not treated as prisoners. We are enemy nationals, but we are given soap and chocolate. Are we being broken by cruelty, or are we being broken by something far more dangerous? By the realization that our enemies might be more human, more structured in their decency than we ever imagined." The slow, steady drip of humanity was successfully eroding their certainty, setting the stage for the final shattering truth.
So the new year of 1946 brought the final, crushing destruction of their existing beliefs. While they knew the war was over since August, the details had been heavily censored by the camp administration to maintain order and control over information flow. Now, the full scope of the war's end arrived via uncensored newspapers distributed in the barracks.
The first devastating reality they faced in print, the atomic bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities just obliterated by a single weapon. The photographs were incomprehensible in their scale of destruction, the human cost too large to grasp.
Sachiko, the nurse, collapsed immediately when she saw the photos, realizing with devastating finality that her son had been in Hiroshima. The sheer finality of that loss, coupled with the revelation of the weapon's power, confirmed the technological material defeat of Japan.
And the propaganda's second fundamental lie, that the homeland was safe and that Japan was winning, was proven false by the widespread photographs of Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama. Not damaged, but reduced to miles of ash and rubble. Every word of the pre-war propaganda, every assurance of victory, was proven false by the pictorial evidence right there on the pages.
But the narrative attack wasn't purely focused on military defeat. The Americans also provided detailed accounts and graphic photographs of Japanese POW camps in the Philippines, Burma, and Thailand. Skeletal Allied prisoners, men who looked like walking corpses, detailed accounts of torture, starvation, and executions.
And this created a fierce, immediate internal conflict. Micho and the hardliners insisted that the POW camp photos were purely American propaganda, distributed solely to justify the bombings and the atrocities the Americans had just committed against civilians.
So they're clinging desperately to the idea that these photos of Allied suffering were the only lies in the stack of newspapers.
Exactly. But the seeds of doubt, planted by months of chocolate bars and hot baths, had taken root among the younger women. Yuki, who had gone from screaming terror to enjoying weekly baths, asked quietly, "We were told American soldiers were beasts. They've given us soap and chocolate, and they have adhered to rules. Why would the prison camp photos be the only lies? Why would they lie about everything else but choose to tell the truth about their own moral conduct?"
That's the killer question. The worldview had collapsed. If the government lied about victory, about the extent of American prosperity, and about the fundamental nature of the enemy, how could they possibly trust the narrative that their own forces were universally honorable?
They were forced to look at the painful contrast, their own healthy, well-fed bodies versus the photos of skeletal Allied prisoners. The physical evidence of their own well-being undermined their last defense of nationalistic pride.
Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, committed to the idea that successful repatriation required basic understanding of the enemy system, then introduced a systematic program of educational rewiring. They were shown films and lectures about American democracy, the Constitution, and the concept of individual rights.
For women raised under a system of divine mandate, where the state was everything and the individual is nothing, these concepts were entirely radical. The idea that government derived its power from the consent of the governed, not divine decree, was staggering. The idea that individuals possessed rights that the state could not violate was revolutionary.
Cohn noted one specific concept that shook her deeply: freedom of speech. She wrote in her diary, "The concept is that people can criticize their government without being arrested or killed. In Japan, such criticism would be treason, a betrayal of the emperor. But here, they say it is a right, a source of national strength. What kind of nation considers criticism a right rather than a crime against the state?"
And that is the fundamental ideological shock. They were seeing a system where dissent was viewed as an integral source of accountability and strength, not a threat to be purged.
The American prosperity films, showing massive factories, consumer goods, and widespread private land ownership, reinforced the visual evidence of abundance, raising the ultimate uncomfortable question that the propaganda could never answer. Why had their divine nation, which boasted of spiritual strength, been so thoroughly outmatched and destroyed by an enemy supposedly lacking honor and caring only for comfort?
This internal ideological struggle took a deeply personal turn in March, as the logistical wheels of repatriation slowly began to turn. Co volunteered for outside work on a nearby lettuce farm owned by the Rodriguez family.
Mrs. Rodriguez, a Mexican-American woman whose son was currently serving in the U.S. Army in Germany, became Co's unexpected bridge to true, non-military humanity. She treated Co simply as a worker, not an enemy national. No excessive kindness, but certainly no hostility, just a coworker.
During lunch breaks, Mrs. Rodriguez shared her simple food: tortillas, beans, fruit. This was not charity, it was simple, human sharing. It was the same food she fed her own family.
And the most moving moment came when Mrs. Rodriguez showed Co a photograph of her soldier son overseas. She pointed to Co, then to herself, then to the photo, communicating a silent connection that transcended language barriers and national conflict. Your country and my son's country fought, but you and I were just people mothers, workers trying to survive the terrible reality of the war and keep our families fed.
That individual human connection utterly dissolved the remaining political boundaries. The black and white narrative of the enemy finally dissolved entirely into the complex, shared shades of gray of universal human experience. And this led to the final, deeply philosophical late-night conversations in the barracks.
Kaur, having processed these months of contradictions, articulated the unbearable question in her diary. I have begun to think the unthinkable. What if the enemy's greatest weapon was not the atomic bomb or their endless food, but kindness? What if they understood that treating us with basic human dignity would accomplish what torture never could, would make us question everything we believed, destroy our faith in our own leaders? This realization is more painful than death.
To die for the emperor was simple and honorable. To live and realize that the emperor and the state cared nothing for them, that they had been lied to and suffered for nothing, was an unbearable weight. The Americans hadn't just defeated Japan militarily, they had fundamentally broken the internal ideological mechanism that drove Japanese nationalism simply by applying the Geneva Convention and providing hot water, food, and basic decency.
By May 1946, the camp was in the state of anticipatory dread. Ships were being prepared. And then Lieutenant Colonel Harrison made the final, profound administrative announcement.
He stated that ships would begin transporting Japanese nationals home starting in July. But he added an unthinkable option. If anyone feared returning, wished to seek asylum, or wanted alternative placement, they could speak up, and the U.S. government would consider their petition.
This created an immediate, painful divide. Micho, the ideologue, insisted that to stay would be to spit on our ancestors. It was cowardice and betrayal.
But others looked at the reality they knew. Japan was rubble, starvation was widespread, there were no jobs and no future for women who had spent a year as enemy prisoners.
And Yuki, who had lost her family in the Tokyo firebombing and had found this unexpected safety in the strange abundance of America, quietly applied to stay. She could no longer reconcile the lies of her homeland with the decency of her captors.
Ko wrestled with the choice for weeks. To stay meant safety, abundance, and freedom from the toxic lies she had suffered under. To go back meant returning to ruin, scarcity, and a government she now fundamentally despised.
But she was bound by the duty of a Japanese daughter to her mother.
Ultimately, she chose to return. Not for the emperor or the government, but for that singular personal duty to her mother in Osaka. Her final ritual before departing was her last visit to the bathhouse. Ko held the worn sliver of the original soap she had saved, now just a tiny, faint piece of white. She soaked slowly in the communal pool, trying to memorize the feeling of the hot water and the clean towels, knowing these luxuries would not exist where she was going.
She shared a final, poignant conversation with Sachiko, the nurse who was returning to the ruins of Hiroshima to find her son's grave. And Sachiko offered this powerful, synthesizing observation. We're going back to rubble. But at least we're going back as ourselves, as individuals capable of judgment, not as the women we were when we arrived. Women defined by dogma. The Americans gave us that, whether they meant to or not.
The change was internal and irreversible. Ko's final diary entry captures the new identity she carried home. I'm going home to a country I no longer recognize. I am returning as a changed woman. The Americans tried to kill my cities, but they fed my body. The Japanese government claimed to protect me, but they nearly killed me with lies. The battle inside me, the battle between what I was taught and what I have experienced, has just begun.
That subsequent voyage, in July 1946, was the mirror image of the first, a journey of dread toward ruin. But Ko was no longer a terrified, loyal subject. She was a questioning individual carrying the heavy burden of truth.
Her first glimpse of Yokohama confirmed the absolute scope of the betrayal. The city was not damaged, gone. Miles of rubble, the sickening stench of ash and destruction. She found her mother and brother eventually living frail, thin, in a shack in the countryside.
And her mother immediately noticed the painful contrast between her daughter and the starving locals. You've gained weight, she observed. Ko simply admitted the unavoidable truth. The Americans fed us. We were prisoners, but they fed us and treated us according to their law.
Ko struggled intensely to readjust to scarcity rice mixed with weeds, one piece of fish per week. She missed the canteen, the hot water, the soap that smelled like lavender, luxuries that were now incomprehensible.
She adapted, found work as a teacher in a makeshift school, and used the minimal English she picked up in the camp as a vital asset under the occupation. She hid her diary, the full record of her transformation, under the floorboards, unwilling to share the depth of her intellectual betrayal.
Years later, in the comparative peace of the 1960s, her daughter asked her the inevitable defining question, "Did you hate the Americans?"
And Coe's powerful answer serves as the final legacy of this story, and the deepest insight we can take from these sources. She said, "I was supposed to. I tried to. But it's hard to hate someone who feeds you when you're starving. Hatred is simple. What they gave us, kindness, basic human dignity, it complicated everything. It made us see them as human, and once you've seen your enemy's humanity, you can't unsee it. That knowledge is a burden you carry forever." This incredible account, drawn from the forgotten corners of World War II history, offers a stark, painful lesson. The war killed millions. But for these 50 women, the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal was not the atomic bomb, it was a bar of soap.
The profound lesson here is that the consistent application of basic human rights, codified by documents like the Geneva Convention, even to captured enemies, revealed the utter hypocrisy and profound betrayal of their own leadership, whose propaganda had been absolute. The simple, quiet act of providing basic human dignity accomplished what torture never could. It forced them to question the core of their ideology until it collapsed.
The story of the bathhouse is a monument to the stubborn persistence of human dignity and the ultimate power of lived, personal experience over engineered, state-sponsored ideology.
Yeah.
It reminds us that humanity, delivered in the form of clean water and lavender soap, can stubbornly persist and undermine even the most rigid systems of hatred.
Coe's greatest lesson was to question what you're told and trust the empirical evidence of unexpected kindness. Don't let political dogma convince you to ignore that evidence. She learned that the hardest thing to carry is not the memory of suffering, but the memory of unexpected mercy.
And that raises our final provocative thought for you to carry forward as we close out this deep dive. In our modern world, where media and politics constantly seek to simplify complex global conflicts into easy narratives of monsters and heroes, how do we actively seek out and honor the complicated human evidence? The quiet moments, the mundane acts of decency, the bar of soap moments that contradict the simple, comforting narrative of hatred. That struggle for complexity, as Koya found, is not just a historical curiosity. It is a battle for self-awareness that we all carry today.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Hidden Front history. We'll talk to you next time.